Okay, thank you. And yes, Brian, I think dissecting really the pretensions of AI and the fact that this is actually being sort of pushed towards us as something that's fully creative and is a good starting point for this paper, which I've provocatively titled Generative AI, the Death of Computer Art. Now, this came together as a short paper. I was about to say it came to me in a dream, as one of our speakers said yesterday. Not quite in a dream, but certainly in a flash, and that's why I rushed it out just before the EVA deadline. As you've seen, I was actually late for my own chairing session. Apologies there. I tend to do these things in the sort of in the moment if I can. But this does actually arise also from things that Sean was talking about too, which is actually looking back to our history. And the thing that triggered it perhaps was partly a talk given by Jascha Reichart and Robert Devchich at the ICA this February. It was called Before and After Cybernetic Serendipity. Jascha, at the age of 90, still giving incredibly cogent and interesting not just reminiscences, but actually reflections on the current state of AI, because, of course, she was very much looking at the role of robots back in the 1960s. So she really was far ahead of this curve compared to everyone else, and that's why it took the art world, 60 years to catch up with her. So it's wonderful that she's still able and willing to review the state of the world now. And she said something which I thought was rather telling, which was that she said that the modern approach to generative AI, particularly the GANs that are used to generate images, is really a brute force approach. They're trained on enormous databases of images, and unethically so in some cases, though we're still trying to determine whose images go into them and what comes out at the other end. I'll get onto that in a second. But this isn't so much about the ethics as the actual way that the things are constructed. And she made the point that previously, the approach had been more about expert systems or symbolic AI, and that this actually had been disregarded in favour of these LLMs, which, as we'll see, is really a product of modern computing power, being able to leverage these sort of large databases and the speed of the current internet and cloud computing. Expert systems, just to come back to these briefly, these actually involve a knowledge base, inference engine, and a way for users who are non-experts to actually discover expert knowledge through questioning the system. And you might say, well, that's not too similar to ChatGPT, but they tend to be very focused. They tend to be tools, to help scientists, tools to look at clinical support for various diseases, identification of bacteria, etc. And they're based on earlier paradigms of artificial intelligence. They generally do not need the enormous processing power that's possible now, because they were developed in the 1970s and with the systems of that time. I'm not saying they're better. I'm not saying this is it's not a sort of like-for-like comparison, but rather these rules-based systems are not simply leveraging the enormous database just for the purpose of constructing a sentence that may or may not be false. That these are actually looking for some sort of expert truth in a way, and they're actually there to help you find your way towards that. So it's actually a rather different worldview behind them. I'm not saying either that they fully realise the potentials of AI. That term has been bandied around for so long, and has come back in several different incarnations. So we should be rightly suspicious, as Brian pointed out, of any claims of general artificial intelligence, which is, of course, the acronym GAI, generative AI, is often confused with general AI. That shouldn't be the case at all. But Jascha pointed to Harold Cohen, known to many of you for what he developed with his Aaron system, but as an example of somebody who leveraged those earlier paradigms of expert systems to make an art-making system, which, as he says here himself, it was not a tool in an orthodox sense, a sort of assistant, and yet one that perhaps wasn't sort of learning per se, but rather one that was just experimenting with form. That said, as he programmed it and honed it and evolved it, it went from being sort of highly abstract and just looking at ways of enclosing space towards something that was somewhat approximate to some of the images he originally himself drew as a painter, but also evolved its own style. And I think that process of evolution is a key thing here. It's not simply using stochastic processes to sort of push sort of several images together and generate something out of that. Rather, it was a painter's engagement with the systems of programming to understand the bases of that. And I have seen several articles saying that Cohen was some sort of prophet of current generative AI. I don't think he was. I don't think that's the point at all. I think actually he was doing something fundamentally artistic with a system. And that too is the case with other early computer pioneers who themselves wrote their algorithms and they understood their systems from the ground up. That to me is the sort of point here, is that this was actually something he was closely involved with. And, you know, I'm not doing this to be, you know, the meme of the old man shouting at the cloud, that sort of thing. Oh, this, you know, the new stuff is terrible, the old stuff was better, but rather it's more about the fundamentals of understanding these systems. And whilst he did not, I mean, I should emphasize, did not consider himself to be a computer artist, criticized the term and criticised some other pioneers such as Charles Shurey and Harman and Knowlton who were at Bell Labs. Nonetheless, others like Friedrich Narker, Georg Nies, and those the German school who were influenced by the philosopher Max Spencer, who was looking at a way of expressing art as information, whether or not that was a good way to take it. Nonetheless, they themselves came to conclusions about generative art and algorithms as well. So I think, you know, we shouldn't say that these early systems were necessarily leading up to what we do now with GANs. I think that's quite a different sort of path to be taking. And, you know, I think this is, you know, these early drawings from Aaron are particularly indicative of that. I think it's a system that's exploring the possibilities of image making, not trying to make something recognizable out of pre-existing images. I think that's a key thing. And, you know, the LLMs, as they have emerged, you know, we are taken in to a degree by the, I suppose, the ease of use. Up to a point. I mean, I don't think prompts are necessarily the best way or the only way to be interfacing with them. As a number of people have said recently, some recent videos I've watched, the use of prompts to sort of help generate images is actually taking us back to the days of text-based interfaces, which is something I got away from in the 1980s when I got my first Amiga. You know, that was the thing that opened up image making to me, was having a mouse and being able to see images on form on the screen that didn't involve typing. And the drawback of that was that I never fully got into programming apart from early websites and working with HTML. But anyway, that aside, there are, you know, we've developed more nuanced ways of creating images with the tools that we had before GANs emerged. Nonetheless, they have, you know, taken over in a short space of time. But equally, the way that they do it is interesting. You know, they take a sort of input of the random noise of the sort of distribution through the generator, but they pull on a previously labelled, a previously sort of explained database of what constitutes, say, faces. Then they discriminate between them, run them together, and eventually they come out with something that's actually utilised elements from what's in that database, but they produce something that seems new. And you know, it's basically the result of a neural network. And that is, you know, sort of magnified by the processing power behind it, which is, of course, why they are so energy intensive. I mean, the other thing about the earlier systems is they were very elegant and actually not sort of so energy intensive. They didn't need to sort of leverage that amount of power. So, nonetheless, it's a combination of availability, ease of use to some degree, but also the spread of this very rapidly and the amounts of money being leveraged behind it. I read somewhere that the spend on AI of all types just this year is about 600 billion across, you know, the entire, you know, all the corporations, and yet having sunk that amount into it, they are not recouping that amount of money. It's quite interesting that they're all throwing things into this, you know, into this area, but as yet they're not really seeing a return, even though they're burning through that amount of processing power, energy, money, etc. So, you know, and I'm not even going to touch the ethics side at all. That is, you know, a huge hot potato, and rightly so. I mean, as you may know, if you put in the right sorts of prompts, you can start to evolve images that look rather like copyrighted Marvel characters, etc., etc. So what we're seeing here is not something that's really engaging with image making, but more fundamentally, it's not really an artistic tool. It's not something, perhaps, that any of our previous computer artists who expert, you know, sort of tool makers, tool users, finding ways to utilize the computer in that sense. They're not actually sort of able to see into the system. And I think that's a very sort of fundamental thing with these LLMs, is that it mentions the New York Times reporter Kevin Roose, the Bing chat system said that it loved him, but also tried to persuade him to kill himself, various other things. And just by sort of following certain lines of argument, he was able to encourage it towards certain behaviour that it supposedly wasn't able to do. People look at that and say, aha, that's evidence of intelligence. Actually, that's evidence of inscrutable processes that are taking place. And, none of those who make these systems are actually fully cognizant of what goes on in the so-called black box. So, whether we think, yes, we can derive useful outputs from them, that's obviously why people are taking to these systems, or whether in fact it's merely the novelty of them, is a very key question. But that inscrutability, I think, is totally against the approach of early computer artists. They had a fundamental understanding of what they were doing and what they were trying to make the systems do. It's not that they simply wanted to get specific outputs, that they couldn't be surprised by what came out of their systems, but rather that they at least knew what was going on under the hood, as it were. So I think, therefore, generative AI is a challenge to earlier approaches to computer art. I'm not even trying to determine if the stuff coming out of it is art or not. I mean, others, such as Manovich, have been, sort of rather bullish in their support for that sort of artistic process. But I'm just saying, if you take the approach of the earlier computer artists, it's very fundamentally different. And I think that's something that I've been finding too. Just in my own engagement, just to say I've not been simply looking at this from the outside, I got into generating some images myself using the DALL-E engine that you can access through Microsoft Bing. Why was that? Because it was free, because I didn't have to sort of go through the interface of Midjourney and get into Discord. That's something I didn't really want to sort of have to do. Like I said, I have a bit of an allergy to the whole text-based input sort of side of things. However, I decided to find out what prompts could be used to make effective images through DALL-E. Now, this started last year in August, and in the sort of the second half of last year, there was a significant jump in the abilities of the DALL-E system, at least out through the Bing engine. So I did one set of images, which I'll show you in a second, and then I got to do another set of images towards Christmas, and the extraordinary leap in its capabilities was evident. So I'm not immune to the, the allure of the apparent realism of the things that come out of these engines at all, but rather I wanted to reflect on the why. People may not know that I have a side interest in various symbolic systems, the tarot being one of them. These are the Rider-Waite-Smith images, the ones in the centre, which are, I believe, now out of copyright because, of course, it's more than 100 years have elapsed. Ryder was the publisher, A. Waite was the sort of the occultist and scholar who developed them, but Pamela Smith was the artist. She was very much part of the late 19th century symbolic movement, also very much involved with the theatre, and it's only recently she's actually had the credit she deserves by sort of what people have called before the Rider-Waite deck is now Rider-Waite-Smith, and rightly so. But these images are widely reinterpreted. People come up with their own illustrations for the RWS cards. There are dozens and dozens of decks out there, some good, some bad, some whatever, and some major artists, even like DALL-E, have done their own decks as well. So what I wanted to do was to generate full decks of cards using prompts that didn't just say generate the strength card. It may well have known what I was looking for. I didn't want that at all. I wanted to describe in that image what I saw and see what the system came up with. And important things there, you've got things like the infinity symbol, you've got the action of actually, it's basically, symbolising internal inner strength and suppressing one's animal instinct, as it were. That's part of the point of strength. But so suppressing the lion, but somebody who's doing so with their sort of inner rather than outer strength. And this is what the first version, it's not the only image it came up with, but this is the one that struck me, because it was a striking image. It's actually the lion's tongue itself is turned into the infinity symbol. It's something I did not expect. So the novelty actually struck me, and just the backdrop and everything else, I just thought, yeah, I like the composition. And that's what got me started. And, X number of cards later, I'd finally generated an Sardon tarot deck. I have a version of it here, which you can look at later. Then, later in the year, I thought, what's DALL-E up to now? I saw there'd been a new release, so I started doing the same process again. I'd saved all the prompts that I had, and I ran it through a second time, and this is the image on the right. Now, you can see there, it may actually be closer. It's unusual, embracing the lion. I don't think I've seen a tarot card that looks like that before. I mean, there are many variations. There may well be something out there, but I don't think it was necessarily just finding something in its database. I think in this case it found something quite genuinely striking, and that's again what set me off. I'll do another set of these cards and see where we get to. And we can see here just a few others. The Hermit's quite a key image. Somebody said I like to be like the Aphex Twin. So you can see his face, unfortunately, is a bit sort of wooden in all respects. Weirdly enough, the Hermit's got a staff and a lamp, and in both versions it combined them into a sort of lamp staff. But nonetheless, the snowy background and everything else I thought was rather intriguing. Second time round, interestingly, of course, with a sort of more Chinese featured face, but also with that sort of drawing perhaps on some archetypes of the sort of Eastern wisdom perhaps in there as well, but a more evocative image, I think, for the second one. So I went with that.
But it's missing.
A hanged man. Really quite intriguing in both cases. The first one, a sort of hipster hung from the tree. A hanged man, by the way, is not hanged per se. It's more about sort of gaining internal insights. But the fact he crosses his legs, which is important, the second one captures that, the first doesn't. But it's supposed to be somewhat of a serene image rather than somebody who's necessarily being suspended by the neck. But in both cases, I think something rather striking and interesting. And in the second one, sort of hanging in the void, I thought that was quite an interesting one as well, but quite sort of peaceful and composed. So there we are, it captured that. The moon, I was rather fond of this post-industrial landscape it came up with. The figure shouldn't be there at all. It totally ignored the idea of the dog and the wolf, which appears very firmly in the second one. I have a suspicion in the second version of Dali must be drawing on some tarot cards by that stage. It must have known what I was aiming for, because it comes very close to quite a few of the images. Nonetheless, I ran with it. I thought that was good enough for text too. And judgment as well. Judgment about sort of awaking oneself from sort of in a sort of sleep or quiescence, and moving on into a new dawn, which is, I suppose, what we were doing. Again, I quite rather like the first output rather than the second. The second being a bit more traditionalist. So perhaps that was the change between the version I started with and the second version, was that the surprising, unusual side had been somewhat calmed and smoothed down. It was more polished and professional, but equally lost something in the transition. And the capacity to surprise was lesser in the second version than the first, albeit those were more usable from a graphic design point of view. Whether they would replace illustrators or not is an open question, because the key thing, I haven't shown you some of the cards which involve multiple numbers of things. The suit cards which are quite similar to playing card deck in terms of the numbers of objects. For instance, pentacles. You've got to have, well, with any of them, pentacles, swords, wands, etc. You've got to have the right numbers of objects in those pictures to make it meaningful. It would not give me 6 of something or 4 of something or whatever. If I asked for 5, it would give me 7. If I asked for 3, it would give me 7, 6 or 7. So I had to manipulate those with Photoshop. So I had to fall back on a little bit of manipulation to make it work as a deck. So it proved to my mind that the system was, sort of incapable of fully understanding, perhaps, or willfully misunderstanding things. That's perhaps more the sort of fact. And last of all, I decided to bite the bullet and subscribe to Firefly, mainly for commercial reasons, in the sense that Dali, if you read the user agreement, you'll see that the images in there are not actually for, for sale per se, or at least you can't sort of sell your images, or you wouldn't be covered in the case of a legal case being raised against you, whereas Firefly is actually cleared for commercial use. However, that's probably because it's been trained on the database of Adobe user images. So in fact, anyone who's been subscribing and using Adobe software and who's put their images on the cloud has probably ended up training Firefly. So ethically speaking, I'm not going to distribute these, but it is interesting where I went. Again, the same prompts, now sort of in rather different form. It's, yes, I mean, more commercial, less striking, less perhaps interesting, but a good process to go through. I wanted to sort of do it from start to finish to see really what came up through two versions of the same system and one different system, and where one could go with that. So that's really what was teaching me, but at the same time teaching me that as a serious tool, as a sort of real tool, and certainly something with a reflection on the history of computer art, is not perhaps or Cohen, the others would have wanted, and certainly not something they would have started with. Lastly, and this is one of the first books about computer art that I ever read, Lillian Schwartz's Computer Artist's Handbook. She was a key pioneer in the digital sphere. But Timothy Binkley wrote a foreword to it, and he referred to the computer as an active alter ego, a kind of cultural poltergeist, animated out of numerized abstractions by computation. And this idea, later on, he calls it the wily computergeist. And I quite like that sort of thought, that it's, you know, if you're an expert at the tools and if you're sort of able to use them, but sort of push against them to the degree that an artist needs to actually produce something that's truly not only novel, but actually sort of meaningful from an artistic point of view, then that's really what, you know, the original computer artists were aiming for, and that's the computer's role. But I think your GANs and other things step beyond just being a wily poltergeist, and they actually sort of start to determine what you can do and what you can't do, and I think that's something I'm more supportive of. So there we are. Thank you very much.